Previously, we have studied the accessory organs in relation with the eye, where we have learned about the extraocular muscles of the eyeball, the eyelids, the lacrimal apparatus. Later on, we have seen the dissection of the eyeball of the cow to understand the various layers of the eyeball and various chambers of the eyeball. So after learning those two components, now let us discuss about the sensory organ, the eyeball. In this picture, you are seeing the skull with two depressions, the right and left orbits, which are the bony depressions on the anterior aspect of the skull. The eyeballs and accessory visual structures are located in this orbit. So in the picture, you can see the eyeball with the cornea and the sclera, then the extraocular muscles of the eyeball. What are the contents of this bony orbit? And you have seen this part, the dissection of the cow's eyeball. This is the cornea and this is the sclera. This is the sclerocorneal junction. And you are seeing the extraocular muscles and fat. And in the bony orbit, the contents are this eyeball with extraocular muscles, the optic nerve, and you are seeing bunch of nerves around it. They are the third, fourth, sixth cranial nerves. So what is the third cranial nerve? It is the oculomotor nerve. The fourth is the trochlear nerve. The sixth is the abducent nerve. These three nerves supply the extraocular muscles of eyeball. And you will see the ophthalmic division of fifth cranial nerve. Ophthalmic division of fifth cranial nerve also is seen in the orbit. Then ophthalmic branch of the internal carotid artery. This is the artery, which is also seen along with the corresponding veins. Then the other structure that is seen in the orbit is the lacrimal gland, and the other component which will be occupying the spaces between the structures is the orbital fat. In this picture, you are seeing the eyeball located in the orbital cavity. This is the anterior pole and this is the posterior pole, and you can see the optic nerve coming out, and you can observe the extraocular muscles of eyeball and the orbital pad of fat. So the eyeball is the organ of special sense of sight or vision, and the components of the eyeball are the eyeball and the optic nerve. Nearly 70% of sensory receptors are in the eyes. 40% of cerebral cortex is involved in processing visual information. The eyeballs are located in the orbital cavity in its anterior 1/3, and they are supplied by the second cranial nerve. What is the second cranial nerve? It is the optic nerve. The space between the eyeball and the orbital cavity is occupied by adipose tissue. the bony walls of the orbit and the fat protect the eye from injury. And in this picture, the position of the eyeball, you can see what is orbital axis and what is the visual axis. The eyeball presents two poles, two axes, two planes and two spheres. What are those poles? It's the anterior pole and posterior pole. There are two axes. One is the axis connecting the two poles, that is known as the optical axis. The other one is the visual axis, the axis through which the light rays pass towards the fovea in the posterior part of the eyeball, which you will learn when we are discussing about the retina. At that point, you can learn about the blind spot or optic disc and the fovea. There are two planes. One is along the equator, which is an imaginary plane around the eyeball, which is equidistant from the poles. The other imaginary plane is the meridian plane, which is also an imaginary plane from pole to pole cutting the equator. So, the two planes are imaginary planes. One is the equator, the other is the meridian. There are two spheres. The small sphere, which is the 1/6 in the anterior part, that is the cornea. The large sphere is about 5/6 of the eyeball, and it is the posterior part and is the sclera. So now you know about the two poles, two axes and two planes and spheres of the eyeball. So the layers of the eyeball. There are three layers. They are outer fibrous layer, middle vascular layer which is also known as uveal tract, inner nervous layer. The outer layer, which is fibrous, consists of the posterior 5/6, the sclera, and the anterior 1/6, the cornea. The middle vascular layer or uveal tract consists of the posterior choroid, the middle ciliary body, and the anterior iris. The inner nervous layer, which you are seeing here, this is the histological image, is the retina. The inner nervous layer is the retina, which contains nearly 10 layers with the cells that are involved in the transmission of the visual impulse. And from the posterior pole you can see the optic nerve coming out. There are certain structures inside the eyeball. They are the lens, the aqueous humor, and the vitreous humor or vitreous body. So in this picture you can see the fibrous tunic with the sclera posteriorly and the cornea anteriorly. The vascular tunic, the intermediate layer, with the choroid and its continuation ciliary body and iris. The ciliary body consists of the ciliary muscle and ciliary processes. The innermost nervous tunic, and this is the lens and the cornea, the space between the lens and cornea containing the aqueous humor, and the part behind the lens containing the vitreous humor or the vitreous chamber, and you can see the suspensory ligaments coming from the ciliary body that keep the lens in position. Let us study the details of the fibrous coat, and it consists of the sclera in the posterior 5/6, which is white and opaque, and the function of it is to give the shape to the eyeball, and it also gives the anchorage for the eyeball muscles, that is for the attachment of eyeball muscles. The cornea forms the anterior 1/6. The junction between the cornea and sclera is called the limbus. This is the limbus or sclerocorneal junction. So here also you can see the sclera and the cornea and the junction between the two or limbus that contains a venous sinus called the scleral venous sinus or canal of Schramm that allows the drainage of the aqueous humor into the venous system. The cornea is the external coat in its anterior part. It is clear and transparent epithelial membrane. The light rays pass through it to reach the retina, and it is elliptical in shape with convexity forwards. It is involved in refracting or bending the light rays to focus them on the retina, and when it is injured due to the exposure to any object, it can repair itself easily. It is the only human tissue that can be transplanted without rejection. Coming to the sclera or white of the eye, it forms the outermost layer posteriorly. It is continuous anteriorly with the transparent cornea. It's a fur and fibrous membrane. It maintains the shape of the eye and it also gives attachment to the extraocular muscles. The junction between the sclera and cornea is known as sclerocorneal junction. Coming to the middle vascular coat or uveal tract. This is not only vascular, it is highly pigmented coat. This is concerned with the absorption of light rays and it consists of from posterior to anterior, the choroid, the ciliary body and the iris. These are the three components of the vascular coat or uveal tract. Coming to the choroid, we have seen it in the dissection of the cow's eye. This is the choroid. This lines the posterior 5/6 of the inner surface of the sclera because this is part of the middle coat of the eyeball. And it is very rich in blood vessels and it is deep chocolate brown in color. The light rays enter the eye through the pupil, stimulate the nerve endings in the retina and it is then absorbed by the choroid. This is the pulled up retina and this is the choroid and this greenish glowing area is the tapetum which will be seen in the animals for night vision. And in this picture also you can see the outer choroid, the middle ciliary body and then the anterior iris, the three components of the middle vascular coat. The ciliary body, it is the anterior continuation of choroid. It contains ciliary muscle, which is a smooth muscle, and also secretory epithelial cells which produce the aqueous humor. The ciliary body gives attachment to suspensory ligament which is attached at one end to the ciliary body and at the other end to the capsule of the lens. This is the histological section showing the layers. You can identify the sclera, the limbus, the cornea. Then you can see the ciliary body containing the ciliary muscles. There are ciliary processes. This is nearly 60 to 80 processes will be seen. In this section you are seeing a ciliary process. Coming to the ciliary muscle, there are two sets of muscles. One is meridional fibers or radiating fibers. The other is the circular fibers. and this epithelium lining the ciliary processes you are seeing. They are pigmented and non-pigmented epithelia, both are there. The action of the ciliary body is it facilitates accommodation for the near vision. There is changing the curvature of lens, making it more convex by relaxation of the suspensory ligament. The contraction and relaxation of the ciliary muscles, they change the thickness of the lens, which will bend or refract the light rays entering the eye to focus them on the retina. The epithelial cells lining the ciliary processes, they secrete the aqueous fluid into the anterior chamber of the eye. It is the space between the iris, lens and the cornea. So that space between the iris and cornea is the anterior chamber. The space between the iris and lens is the posterior chamber. The ciliary body is supplied by parasympathetic branches of the third cranial nerve, that is the oculomotor nerve. The stimulation of the ciliary body causes contraction of smooth muscle and accommodation of the eye. Then coming to the iris. This is the extension from the ciliary body anteriorly, and it lies behind the cornea and in front of the lens. This divides the anterior segment of the eye into anterior and posterior chambers, which contain the aqueous fluid secreted by the ciliary body. The iris is a circular body composed of pigment cells, and it also contains two layers of smooth muscle fibers, one circular and the other radiating. In the center of the iris will be the aperture, the pupil. The iris is supplied by both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. Parasympathetic stimulation causes constriction of the pupil, whereas the sympathetic stimulation causes dilatation of the pupil. The color of the iris is genetically determined, and it depends on the number of pigment cells that are present. There are blue colored iris will be seen in some people. Then there are the people with brown eyes. Albinos have no pigment cells, and people with blue eyes, they have fewer than those with brown eyes. So depending on the pigment content, the color of the iris varies. In this picture, you can see the musculature of the iris containing the circular fibers and the radiating fibers. So when there is bright light entering through the eye, the circular muscles contract and reduce the diameter of the pupil, and this is the diameter of the pupil during normal light. And in case of dim light, the radiating muscle fibers of the iris contract, increasing the diameter of the pupil.